Welcome to the Game Plan Coaching Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Joe Baker, one of the world's leading researchers in talent ID and development. Joe is based at the University of Toronto, where he's the Tannenbaum Research Chair in Sports Science, Data Modelling and Sports Analytics. And he's also the author of The Tyranny of Talent. In this episode, we get into the real nuts and bolts of talent, why early selection is so risky, what happens to kids in the messy middle, and how to balance challenge and safety, and why talent is less something you measure and more a process that unfolds over time. We talk about deselection, the role of parents, how coaches can use data in smarter, more human ways. Here's my conversation with Professor Joe Baker. Okay, so let's begin. The choice is yours, Joe. We'll go in three different directions, but you choose the direction we go in. I've prepared some quickfire questions, some myth-busting, or some provocations about talent ID. Where would you like to begin?
Or choose your own adventure. I think any of those sound really fascinating. Maybe the rapid fire to get us going, get some energy up.
Okay, quickfire to start us off then. Is there a cliché associated with talent ID that makes you really cringe?
10,000 hours gets on my nerves quite a bit. Calling somebody naturally talented, I think, is another one. Both of those are cringy for me, but I think there are also opportunities for educating coaches. Like, what do you mean when you say, naturally talented? When you say that, you're confusing talent with just physical stuff. It's not. It's more than that. I think we'll get into that a bit today.
I suppose if somebody says that, it's an open window into a conversation.
For sure. Yeah.
Cool. Is there a myth in talent ID you'd love to erase forever?
Maybe it's not so much a myth. Maybe the myth is that we can identify talent in a meaningful way, and that especially early in an athlete's development. I think that it's not as much a myth as a misunderstanding of what talent is. So if I could get coaches to start using the word talent in a more productive way, then that's a big change that I would love to see. Not that talent doesn't exist, or I don't think that's a myth. I think talent is a real thing. I think we're just under appreciating how complicated and complex it is as a process and as a phenomenon.
What's the one overlooked aspect of the environment that really shapes development?
The importance of intrinsic interest and attraction. I think for me, that is the currency of athlete development. We've got to take care to not undermine those sorts of things, because we can't give that to a person. It has to come from within.
Is there a behavior from an athlete that makes you secretly think there's something here?
Sure, the drive to practice. Though the person that shows up early, that stays late, that wants to put in one more repetition or one more mile, that sort of self-regulation, for lack of a better word, that intrinsic drive that a coach doesn't have to chase that athlete because they're intrinsically driven. For me, that of all the things we could measure, that's the best indicator of talent we've got, I think.
Final one for now. Are either of these riskier for long-term development? Early success or early struggle?
I think they're risky in different ways. Early success is risky because it might develop an understanding that I don't have to work hard because I'm there already. We talked to some coaches at the FA a bunch of years ago, and they were really struggling with kids that were making the transition to junior national teams, and they get the full sort of Team GB kit, and they'd stop striving because they thought they'd made it. And so that's one of the risks of early success. I think the early struggle, the risk is, from a competence perspective, you might think, hey, this isn't the sport for me. Whereas, if you just stuck it out a little bit longer, you might see big changes as you hit a growth spurt or as your skill develops. Early struggle is necessary for long-term learning. And I think a lot of people, if you just focus on am I enjoying this experience I'm having, you might, if you use that as your decision-making for whether I stay in my sport or not, you might actually remove yourself from a system that you're really well suited for.
So there seems to be all these different forces at play. when it comes to identifying and then developing talent. With the early struggle piece, have you seen that done well with the work that you've done in environments where you visited, where coaches are creating environments where the challenge is high, but maybe the support is high alongside it?
I think there are traditionally sports that do it well. I would even say gymnastics is one of those because of the early challenge, the rubrics that gymnastics have for the development of skill, the progressions, the challenge is kind of built into those things. And the supports obviously have to be there as well. So I think gymnastics, a lot of combat sports have those things built in because of the traditions, because of the lessons that have been learned the hard way. The risk for me, though, is this discussions that we're having about athlete maltreatment and psychological safety, that we might, with all good intentions, be removing these opportunities for challenge and for risky engagement that athletes definitely need in order to develop the skills they're going to need further in the pathway. But if we're not systematically thinking about how do we develop those skills early, then we might actually be removing opportunities for them to develop later.
That sounds like quite an ethical balance to be able to strike.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really for me, it's the challenge of the psychology of sport for the next 10 years is figuring out what that balance is.
Is there a changing expectation? Are there things changing in the expectations of athletes coming into systems around like how far they should be pushed or push themselves?
I think there are, and I think that's part of the overall psychological climate of athlete development, certainly in North America with the scandals that we've had in sports like gymnastics. We've had to make some pretty important and radical changes in the system. And I do wonder whether the extremes and, almost trying to redesign the system from the ground up forgets that there was a lot of positive and a lot of good in that system. There was just some monsters that took advantage of it. So for me, I think, we've got to remember that, and maybe the athlete isn't the person that should be making those decisions, because especially in early peak performance sports where we have individuals whose brain is continuing to develop. Maybe they're not the best judges of what's appropriate. Certainly when they feel at risk and certainly when they feel unsafe, we need to know about that. But the decisions about putting athletes into situations where they might feel challenged or at risk, I think we need to think about what's the purpose of that activity. What's the risk of that activity for an athlete at that specific age? And I think we need to make a really important distinction between athletes feeling unsafe and athletes being unsafe. They should never be unsafe, but feeling unsafe can lead to the development of all kinds of psychological skills that will become important later in their development.
I listened to a conversation with a person who was the former academy manager at Manchester United, a guy called Nick Cox, and he spoke about how in the academy at Manchester United, they wanted to make sure that the players had incredible experiences, but they had this variety of experiences that prepared them for when they first step into the first team at Manchester United or any other club. There's nothing that feels completely new. But so travelling to an away game, sitting on the bus for 2 hours, not getting any minutes could be quite prickly for a player. But I suppose then I would challenge the coaches listening to this to think, well, how can then you provide the right help, care and support around that athlete so they've got tools in their toolbox to overcome it?
Yeah, and that's going to be a very individual thing from athlete to athlete, right? And so, for me, that's the art of coaching, is understanding what's the supports that I need to give to this athlete in this moment in time that they're developing in a dynamic way. And sometimes that support is to take a step back, not take a step forward, right? And so we need to be thinking about support from that perspective.
You mentioned a moment ago in the quickfire, but not so, air quote, quickfire, about athlete behavior being something that's really important, and that drive to practice, to stay longer, to do more. Because this podcast is aimed at coaches, from your experiences and what you've seen, what are the types of things that coaches could do with their behavior or the environment that they create that might encourage players to see the benefits of that, but also to create the conditions for them to do those things?
That's the billion-dollar question. For me, the critical thing for coaches, remember, it's two things. One, that Long-term athlete development is just that. It's long-term. It's a commitment over an extended period of time. And the second thing is that the quality of the training environment, whether that's on the pitch or off the pitch, that's all the training ecosystem for an athlete, that's incredibly important, maybe the most important thing for an athlete's long-term development. And that coaches should try to not undermine either of those two things. So an athlete's long-term commitment to their sport or the quality of the learning and training environment. And if coaches could remember that, then they would think about almost every decision from that holistic perspective. They're not always going to get it right because we're not easy to understand in that way. But can you get it right more often than not? And when you get it wrong, are you surrounding that athlete in a environment where they feel cared for, where they're able to flourish? If you can do that, then that's probably a coach's number one job. The skill acquisition stuff can come through interest and through engagement and that technical expertise that a lot of coaches start with. But we got to make sure that we don't get the real important stuff, the intrinsic drive, the quality of the learning, that we get those things right.
The way you've described that, in my mind, that shows up as two overlapping circles. So the long-term commitment to the sport, the quality of the training environment in the short term. And yeah, I'd encourage people listening to this to think about, like, what do they make of that? How could that come to life in their own environment?
Yeah, and it's not, simplistically you could think, well, it's all about enjoyment, but it isn't. High performance sport is not just about enjoyment, or it's about enjoyment that comes from multiple ways, right? Like enjoyment could be the social elements, the sensational elements of playing your sport. But we also, athletes that stay for the long term also get enjoyment from the development of skill, which comes from challenge, which comes from things that the average human might not enjoy, but a high performance athlete will, or they'll have to learn to enjoy it because that striving is so important for skill development.
Joe, we've jumped straight into some of the detail, which I hope we would, just for the benefit of our listeners, and I'm sure some will be really familiar with your work and your book, The Tyranny of Talent. But for those who aren't quite so accustomed to you and the work that you've done, would you give us a bit of an introduction?
Sure. I'm Joe Baker. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto and the Tannenbaum Research Chair in Sports Science, Data Modeling, and Sport Analytics in this new institute that we have called the Tannenbaum Institute for Science and Sport, which is a new initiative that focuses on increasing the quality of data and the quality of evidence that we have for decision-making in high-performance sports systems. This is an area, I've been at the University of Toronto for about 2.5 years now, and this is an area that I've been working in for over 25 years. And it's a really exciting time for high performance sport because we have more data than ever. We have more interested people than ever who want high quality evidence for decision making. And now at the University of Toronto, we have an institute that's working to provide those things. The luckiest guy, I get to go to a job that never feels like work, and I get to have great conversations like this one. Yeah, so it's a lot of fun.
From some of the conversations we've had in the past, I've heard you talk about how it's really difficult to make accurate predictions, especially when some of the athletes we coach are very young. So from the work you're doing, and it sounds really fascinating at the university, are there any headlines or any themes that are emerging from your work that perhaps in 10 years from now coaches would kind of see as commonplace in their work?
I think there's some that when we started were not so commonplace that have become commonplace now, right? Like, when possible, don't have your athletes specialize in a single sport because there's benefit to multi-sport engagement. That's become general practice, but a decade ago it wasn't. The kinds of things that we're hoping will change over the next 10 years is don't put so much weight on early predictions of success. Try not to stream kids into competitive streaming because those competitive streams affect their likelihood of success as a high-performance athlete. And your decisions about who should be in what stream are not as accurate as they need to be to have that impact on an athlete's development. So anytime we can, and we've got to also work within a understanding of the real world that we just can't let everybody do everything all the time. We don't have the resources for that. And so just understanding that when we limit kids' access to competitive and developmental opportunities, we should have a good reason for doing that, and we should understand the implications of doing that for the kids that are in our system, but also the ones that get deselected.
Deselection, what a massive point. And what happens to those children after they are deselected when perhaps they could come back in at a later time.
Yes, exactly. Right. And that's for me, the flexibility of a system so that it's not so linear, that, multiple entry and exit points on the, the road to success. That should definitely be our philosophy, but also recognizing that, if you deselect a player at the U13 level and they want to come back at U15, they've spent maybe 2 years in a system that wasn't as designed for their skill development as the people that stayed in that system. So to an extent, you are comparing apples and oranges once they're deselected.
What would be the ideas that we should think about when it comes to identifying future athletes and future performers that would mean that our pathway and our system for athlete identification and development is doing as much of the right things as it could?
I think opportunity is the biggest one. As many opportunities as possible. And I think not just from a diversification of skill set perspective, but when you provide more opportunities, you provide more opportunities for the fit between an athlete and their sport to be optimized. When you put an athlete into a single sport when they develop, as amazing as that sport might be, it might not be the one that the athlete is interested in. When you expose them to more opportunities, you increase the likelihood of getting that match right. For me, it took me a long time to find endurance sport. And when I did, it fit the way that what I wanted out of my sport experience. My wife is a team sport athlete, and any team sport she wants to play. I hate team sports because I don't want to work as part of a group. I don't want to share success or failure with somebody else. I want that to be my responsibility. She does not like my sports and I don't like hers. So I think recognizing that we're not interchangeable cogs that can fit into any system. There are needs and wants and desires that attract us to specific sports. And we should try to figure out how to get that right for people. It's why I like the approach that Belgium has with the sport compass that they use, where it starts with asking kids, what do you like to do? Do you like to be outside? Do you like to be inside? Do you like to run, or do you like to think? And it tries to give them a list of sports where the intrinsic qualities that they start with are matched to the activities that you give them. You don't try to force them into an activity that they may not be interested in.
Never heard of the Belgium Sport Compass, and after we finish today, I'm definitely going to go and look at that.
I'll flood you with some research that they've done. It's a really fascinating approach.
Fantastic. Thank you. When you say about as many opportunities as possible, my mind went to, and I'm thinking from a football lens, which is my home sport. Okay, lots of opportunities to play and to train, but equally within those opportunities, let's play 3v3, 5v5, 7v7. So diversity of experience, if you like, within those opportunities.
Yes, for sure. Diversity in terms of the sports, but also diversity in terms of even within a single sport diversity, especially early in development, where we, if we can't get a multi-sport engagement pattern, or we can't assume a multi-sport engagement pattern, then how do we recreate that within a sport? And we do that through variability of experience, whether 3v3, 11v11, whatever it ends up being. We're working on different let's call them skill acquisition systems through that diversity.
Right, Joe, let's move on to the next part of our conversation. And as our listeners will know, in every episode, we're building our game plan. So this shared playbook of ideas and stories and lessons that coaches can draw on. And every guest so far has added something really unique into our game plan. So what's your addition?
My addition is around talent. So I think we can use the word talent, but we need to forget about it as something to be measured or quantified or an equation to be solved. Talent is a process that emerges and unfolds over time that we don't really understand very well. And so we need to think about it in terms of not an equation that will predict success, but understanding that long-term success requires extended commitment from an athlete and high quality learning environment. And so we should try our best as coaches, as policymakers, as practitioners, not to undermine either of those things. If we do that right, then talent will take care of itself.
So you talk about the long-term success requires extended commitment. I appreciate fully there's no silver bullet here. There's no one way to do this, but where's the balance or the swirl between a long-term commitment in a sport and that diversification of playing a variety of different sports and activities?
Great question. And I think we have to recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all model that's going to capture all athletes. And sometimes you will have an athlete that all they want to do is their sport. All they want to do is football. I don't see the positive from saying to that athlete, well, you're not going to football today, you're going to field hockey, or you're going to gymnastics or squash, and having to argue with them about that. For me, I don't see the positive elements in that. But can we design a football system where we have more variability and experience? They recognize that the best thing for a young learner's brain is variability, because we want as many synapses firing in a practice session during early development as possible. And we can design a football training to make that happen. For me, I think those are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about with what's the unique environment that I need to provide for this athlete so that they're going to want to come back tomorrow, a month from now, a year from now. And sometimes it's going to be more football. Okay, well, how do we do that so we don't compromise long-term development?
Okay, that makes lots of sense. And again, I think it would be really valuable for coaches listening to this to think about, well, how does that work in the context of where I'm coaching? Because we're not starting with a blank piece of paper. There's lots of existing norms and ways of doing things within their sport or their club or environment. But perhaps being able to dig into what are the moves I've got available to support that long-term engagement and enjoyment in the sport, and really think about the quality of what's happening in my practice.
Yeah, and I think in North America, one of the reasons why we have to focus so much on this issue is because our physical education courses are not delivering the sort of broad-based movement experience that kids need for that foundational movement skill. And so, I don't know how it is in the UK, but if our physical education system did a good enough job of providing that, then sport wouldn't need to. We could build the sport-specific skill. It's because there's a mismatch. And, I don't want to put it all on the PE system, but when kids are spending more of their incidental time at home in front of screens and not moving around, not playing in backyards, not climbing trees and those kinds of things, then the system has a gap that it needs to make up. And we can get that through PE, or we can recreate a sports system so that it provides those things. It didn't used to have to do that because of the way that kids used to move. Now they're not. The world has changed. And so sport needs to fill that gap.
There's been something I've been meaning to ask you a bit more about since one of the conversations we had a few years ago when I was at UK Coaching. And you were kind enough to come on and deliver a workshop to some coaches sharing some of your research. And you posed a question, and I'm paraphrasing here. How bad can you be at 12 years old and then still go on to be an elite performer? And it's really stuck to me, that question, because I think my experiences tell me in some of the environments I've been in, we make selection or deselection decisions quite early, but aren't necessarily allowing time, variety of experience, exposure to different things to play their part in where that person is at. Just wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about that statement.
Yeah, I think the statement, and I continue to ask that question to coaches, because I think we need to have that understanding of an athlete's longitudinal development that we don't really have, especially in the research that's provided. It's cross-sectional data. It's not tracking athletes across the time spans that we really need in order to provide strong evidence for coaches. If we had that longitudinal data, we'd be able to answer that question. Not how good do you need to be, but how bad could you be and still stay in the system, which I think tells us a little bit about performance tracking and metrics that we might use for identifying athlete, but it also tells us about the psychology. Like, how does somebody who might not be at the top of their cohort still stay involved in their sport for a long period commitment in order to maximize those benefits later on? That doesn't fit with a lot of the motivational research that we see, which says, if you're not getting continual competence feedback, you're probably not staying. And so for me, there's a performance question there, but there's also a really cool psychology question there. Why would somebody stay if they weren't at the top? It could be because they're having fun with their friends. Okay, well then we need to maximize fun with their friends if we want kids to stay. Or it could be, I wasn't measuring myself relative to others. Is that sort of task versus ego distinction that we see in sports psychology. I was there because I was getting better. I didn't care how I measured relative to everyone else. Okay, well, then we need to provide feedback in a really specific way. For me, there's so many questions there that tell us how to help coaches maximize engagement with athletes across the pathway that we don't really know the answers to yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from spending time looking at your work and other researchers in talent development, kind of a key headline that really stood out to me was that early success is not necessarily a predictor of long-term achievement. Yeah. And the thing that kind of emerged for me was paying attention to children in the group who are in the messy middle. They're working really hard and they're staying with the trouble. Again, if for coaches listening to this and that information feels new, what would be the things that you would try and guide a coach's attention towards?
I think the messy middle is a great way to frame that cohort, right? If you think about all of the athletes that you get exposed to, the clear talents are easy to identify. The ones that are not going anywhere, that are mismatched to the sport, those are also easy to identify. It's the messy middle that is the challenge for coaches. And so I would say coaches should recognize how complicated and complex that process and that decision making is. This is maybe the most difficult thing that we ever ask a human to do, to take a measure of a person's function and performance at this point in time and predict where they're going to be 10 years from now. We don't do that in any other domain of human endeavor, but we ask coaches to do that. We have them make decisions that have long-term implications for a person's likelihood of success, and they have to do it with every athlete on a continual basis every single year. That is a tough thing, and we under-equip coaches to be able to do that thing because they don't get trained in measurement or human development. Their education is predominantly focused on technical skill development and coaching. Hey, let's appreciate how complicated this thing is first and give them a bit of freedom to be wrong. We learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes. And if we give coaches opportunities to say, you know what, I really blew it, and here's how I did it, and here's how I would change what I will do with the next group of athletes, that's where the learning comes. That's where the system change comes. And I think we need to create environments where those kinds of discussions are happening more often.
Absolutely. We started the conversation talking about talent ID and selection, but there's a shadow to that. There's the non-selection or the deselection, which a coaching friend of mine once framed deselection for me to say, well, it changes the arc of somebody's life if you're taking them out of an environment where they want to be. So we need to react with care when we're making those types of big decisions. Again, like drawing on your research and your experiences, is there anything that coaches should be considering or thinking about when they're making those decisions about athletes who may not be part of that program in the future?
For sure. I think, if we come back to the messy middle part, that this is the challenge for coaches because we're really not sure about their long-term potential. Well, then if we accept that and we acknowledge that, then the best thing we can do is make sure that our selection decisions have the least impact on their interest in the sport as possible. The perfect selection decision is if you tell an athlete, sorry, you're not selected for the team this year, and that has no impact on their interest and desire and engagement in the sport. They go back and train just as hard. Maybe they train harder because you've told them feedback that they're going to prove you wrong. We need to provide opportunities for coaches to think about feedback from that perspective. How can we soften the landing for an athlete so that their whole identity isn't tied up to being, I failed in this sport? Well, we can certainly do better than that. And one of the approaches that I really like comes from the work that the Queensland Academy of Sport is doing. They've got the most aggressive talent ID. They call it a talent transfer strategy going into the Brisbane Olympics in 2032. And for every athlete that comes into their program, the way that they provide feedback is really cool. And if they say you haven't been selected for the national program or the state program, and then they add 3 letters, yet. And that word is a powerful word. It's empowering to hear just that little word at the end of a sentence where you get feedback, because it frames the conversation differently than in this simple sort of binary. Some people won and you lost. No, we can certainly do better than that in the way that we give that feedback.
That, for me, aligns completely with what you just said around softening the landing. And it's not tokenistic at all. We tried some of that while I was coaching at Arsenal a few years ago on the women's programme, and it was so competitive for the players to find a space in the academy. And we always found by saying no, it would cause friction and tension, and we didn't want these people to just be repelled away from us and never want to come back again. And we wanted them to carry on playing the game. And we changed our language from no to not yet. And then with that, gave a few little nudges or prompts to say, well, not yet, and these things might help.
Yeah, I think it's empowering for the athlete, but it's also realistic for the coaches because it assumes a certain level of error in the decision making, that a binary, these are this is the future and you are the past. Just adding a yet, it sort of assumes that there's an error rate in the decision making that I think is a better way for coaches to be thinking about this process.
And I think from some of your work, you've talked about talent identification as a dynamic process rather than something static and fixed in time.
Yeah, and importantly, the things that predict performance in early development and the things that predict it later are totally different things. So, you might have selected for great performance early on, but that doesn't mean that person's always going to be a great performer. The targets are shifting.
Joe, I feel like I could talk to you about all this forever, and this is lighting up my brain talking to you. I'd love to spend a little bit of time looking at some inverted commas myths around talent ID, talent development. And you've spent your career challenging sports systems assumptions about talent. So some of these we might have touched on already, but I think worth just putting out there to just quickly talk through. Let's call this semi-quick fire. So myth number 1, talent can be spotted early.
I think I would say 99% myth. 1% is in sports where very simple predictors are relevant. So height, for example, we have a kid that plays for the Florida Gators in the NCAA who's the tallest teenager on the planet. Well, he's in the right sport. Basketball is the right sport. Yeah, those things are simple. He was identified very early. I think at 11 or 12. He was already at 13. He was 6'10", which I don't know what that is in meters, but he was one of the tallest teenagers in the world at that point. Basketball is a no-brainer. Gymnastics, no, he's not. Other than those really simple things, then no, you can't identify it early.
More training means faster development.
Again, I think this is one that's mostly myth. Training is related to development, but it's not the only thing. And I think when we think about training as the primary variable predicting success, we forget that there's a complex psychology underpinning that. Somebody's interest in training is because of how much that they want to train. We can't force somebody to want to train more. That has to come from intrinsic drive. So somebody who's putting in more training is probably an indicator that we got the psychology of their development right. More than training being the variable, it's probably a proxy for something else.
You've actually taken my mind to some of Jean Cotte's work around deliberate play, deliberate practice, and how actually the intentionality of the training could make a big difference.
For sure. Yeah.
You've touched on this one already. I'm going to ask it anyway. Genetics determine the ceiling.
I think it probably does, but in a real roundabout way. Like, we have to remember that genetics will determine the ceiling of very simple things like height. And then there's, it might determine the absolute ceiling if we put all of our training resources into a specific capacity and we focused on that over providing the best environments over the longest term possible. Then we might run up against a genetic ceiling. But the reality is that most people in most sports are nowhere near the limits of genetic potential. And so what we have instead is a combination of getting the genetics and the environment correct. And that's what we see in performance, is always an interaction between a person's genetics and the environments that we put them in. It doesn't mean genetics is a ceiling, but eventually genetics will be the ceiling for potential because as humans, we're limited by the limits of our genetics.
There's one best pathway to the top.
Total myth. I think other than vague generalizations, there is no single pathway to the top. This is an individual journey, and we need to be thinking about this in terms of, especially for coaches, to be thinking about what do I need to do to ensure that this person in front of me is flourishing. And that might be completely different from athlete to athlete.
Final one. I'm really curious about what you're going to say to this one, because it's been a reoccurring theme through lots of conversations on this podcast. Parents should stay out of development.
I think that's a myth. I think we need to have roles for parents. I think the challenges with parents is when they don't understand what their role is. They think that they need to be the technical advisor, the skill acquisition corrector on the drive home. No, we need to have a role for parents. And that's what we've tried to do in our work, is to get sports to clarify this is the coach's role. The coach is the technical director, the skill acquisition specialist, the feedback provider. And the parent's role is unconditional love and support. You are the security and safety blanket for that athlete. And to get those to work together with the coach so that the parents know when the coach has had a tough conversation with that athlete, because they've been part of that. It's a strategy. And so when they do that, well, the parent asks about it on the drive home. They're decompressing and debriefing with that athlete. And maybe they provide that feedback to the coach. You know what? He's really, or she's really struggling with this. Okay, well, then the coach adapts based on that. It's more of a interactive relationship than it is in a lot of sports.
I've seen it in some environments where I've worked in the past, where parents maybe are just seen as the bank and the taxi.
Yeah. Or the obstacle, right? The coach can't do what they would love to do because the parents are yelling at them and demanding that, I think some of the constraints-led approaches would say, the best thing a coach could do is to keep their mouth shut and let athletes figure things out on their own. But parents don't like to see that in coaches. They think they should be shouting instructions all the time. Well, then we've got a mismatch there.
There's the need for that pre-work around framing.
Yes.
What to expect. And like that, I get a bit pernickety sometimes around some of the language that is used when it comes to parents. And I've heard coaches talk about managing parents or dealing with parents. And I don't necessarily think that's really helpful, because it sees them as the enemy, where they're not. Yeah. They're a critical part of the environment. Yeah,
sports that do it well, I think, appreciate that this is a developmental ecosystem that an athlete's in. And the parents are maybe the most important part of that ecosystem, depending on the age group. But it's parents, it's coaches, it's maybe their teachers, it's certainly their peers. And we need to appreciate all those different roles. And if we could figure out a way to get all of those people working in the same direction, what a powerful system we'd have.
Joe, I'd love to move into the final part of our conversation, which is some game-changing advice. Now, the way I like to frame this and position it for our listeners is whatever you share might be something that coaches could pick up and apply straight away in their world. It might be something that they edit or adapt to suit the context of where they're working, or it might not feel quite right now, but whatever you share might be something that they reflect on and maybe come back to at another time. So what's your game-changing advice?
I think we've talked about a lot of pieces of advice that I would give, over the conversation, but one that we haven't talked about maybe yet that I'll leave the group with is around the power of data and information. I think coaches have access to more information than they've ever had before. I would encourage them to not use that information in a predictive way, to try to think about it. How can I use this for measuring an athlete's talent? I would say use it in a diagnostic way. Like, what can this tell me about the kinds of environments I need to provide for my athletes so that they continue to develop? Where are their strengths? Where are their weaknesses? And how do I use that to improve the quality of the coaching that I give them, as opposed to thinking about them as variables in an equation? How can I use this information to design better learning and training environments?
Maybe, yeah, building on what you're saying there, and I'm just making sense of that. Coaches being able to use data to lean into their curiosity and create more options about what they do rather than making judgments.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, for sure. Especially short-term judgments with, high degrees of confidence. No, I think we should we should assume that greater error rates and maybe less confidence, and use our data to try to prevent messing things up instead of using it to predict a future.
Nice. I'll let that one settle for our listeners. Joe, thank you so much for your time. This has been a phenomenal conversation. Well, it has been for me. I've taken loads away. Thank you so much for being such a brilliant guest.
My pleasure, Tom. I enjoyed as always, I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Game Plan Coaching Podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please follow the show and share it with a coach who might find it useful. I'd love to hear your feedback and any ideas for future guests. You can get in touch through the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and go well in your next coaching session.